I'd like you to imagine that, what if I was to introduce you to someone and I said to you that you have to form a very deep personal love for that person, a love that's actually going to dominate your life, and that your life depended on developing that love. Now, what would you do? There's a fair bit of pressure, isn't there? You think, well, what am I going to do? Well, I guess what you'd do is you'd start by, you'd have to spend some time with that person. You'd have to talk to them and listen to them. You'd have to find out about the sort of things that they like to do, spend time with them, and perhaps do the sorts of things that they do. Live like them. And hopefully if you did that after a period of time, depending on what they're like, see how things go. You might hopefully develop a love for that person. But putting that scenario to one side, what does God want from us? What God wants from us is to worship him, doesn't he? He wants us to believe that he exists, to know what he's like, to love him and to trust him. He wants to have a relationship with us, and a very close, personal one at that. But for any of that to happen between us and God, what we've got to do is we've got to, in a sense, do what we would do with that imaginary person. We've got to listen to God. We've got to talk to him. We've got to spend time with him. And we've got to get close to him and try and actually live like him. And do the sorts of things that he would do. Think in the sorts of ways that he would think. Try and, copy that in our life. And of course, that would create a relationship between us and God, as it would do with that person that we'd be doing that with. But of course, because of what God's like, we wouldn't be able to help but form a love for him. And in fact, we would begin to worship him, which is exactly what he wants. But of course, it's all very well to say that we've got to live like God. It's very easy to make that statement, or we say, well, we've got to think like God. But how do you actually do that in everyday life? How do you translate what is obviously a very lofty ideal into the little day-to-day events of our life? And as we said last night, the book of Proverbs perhaps answers that question like no other book in the Bible. Hundreds and hundreds of little hypothetical situations, one after the other in this book. If this happens, respond that way. If someone says this to you, then you should talk to them like this. If you're fearful of this happening, then you should take this attitude. When you're talking with someone, do it this way, otherwise you'll get a reaction like that, but if you do it this way, you get a different reaction. All these little hypothetical situations that we're given, and there's almost 600 of them in the book of Proverbs. So it is quite a unique book. It's very different to anything that comes before or after in Scripture. And you look at this book like this and you think, well, what's the purpose of all these little sayings? Why are we given these? Is it that God is saying, if you keep this list of Proverbs, then you're going to get in the kingdom of God? Well, we know that's not the way it works. We don't get into the kingdom because we keep a list of rules, or a list of Proverbs for that matter. God obviously wants us to keep these Proverbs that we read. He wants us to build them into our life. But we know that salvation doesn't depend on doing a list of things. And in any case, if it did, we know we're inevitably going to fail. So what would be a pass mark? Could we have to do 75% of them? Is it 51%? Is that the pass mark? We know that that's not the way salvation works. And God is telling us in this book, in the most simple, practical way, what it's like to live and to think like him between when we get up in the morning and when we go to bed that night. He's not interested in us keeping a list of laws or a list of proverbs. He's interested in us becoming a certain type of person. That's what he wants to see in our life. And that's what Proverbs is. The book of Proverbs is. It's a priceless guide in our quest to develop our characters in the way that God would have us do. It is so simple, it is so practical, and it is so wise. Now, what we want to do this morning, just very briefly, is just look at an overview of the book, and that's what we're going to do, those four things there. And that'll sort of give us a good launch into looking at some of the Proverbs that we read later on in the sort of last 2/3 of the book. But what actually is a proverb? Well, that's what the word proverb is in Hebrew. So it's a statement or a poem. It doesn't have to be a one. Usually we think of a proverb, we think it's one verse or one little short statement. It can be a long form poem, but it's usually about some sort of superior thinking. It comes from a word meaning to rule or have dominion, related to word meaning compare. So it's usually about thinking. It's something to do with the way we think, leading obviously to action. It often compares two things and says, well, these two things are similar, or sometimes it says these two things are completely opposite, in order to help us decide which way is the best way to go. And we know from 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 32 that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs. Amazing amount of output that he did. And in this book here, we've got about 510 of his proverbs. So presumably, he's written 3,000. We've got the best of the best, because his proverbs would have been the best at the time, and still the best. And we've got the best of the best. We've got 510 of his proverbs, plus there's another around 70 from other writers in this book. So there's almost 600 proverbs in this book. Anyway, that's what a proverb is. Now, what about the structure of the book? How is it set out? I don't want to spend too much time on any of this, but just so that you are aware, which you may already be, but it's basically set out in two different sections, as you can see there. And when we've read through it over the years in our daily readings and looked at it, you can see that there's two distinct halves to the book. They're not actually halves, but they're two sections. The first 9 chapters are quite different to the rest of it. First 9 chapters is sort of long form poetry, and the rest of it is these sort of little one-liners that we get one after the other. But what you get in the first 9 chapters is basically, it describes what wisdom is. What wisdom is, how can we get it? And if we've got it, how are we going to keep it? It tells us that wisdom only comes from God. And it tells us how useful it is in helping us make decisions in life, to avoid pitfalls in life and to make good decisions in our daily life. So it really, the first 9 chapters sort of describe what the concept of wisdom is. And then when we get into from chapters 10 through to the end of the book, that's all about the actual practice of wisdom. We now know what the concept is. What about the practice of it? And so that's where we get these almost 600 little practical examples of how you would put what has been described in chapters 1 to 9 into practice in your life. And if you look at that, if you were to remove chapters 1 to 9, the problem with that is that you could read 10 to 31 with all these little bits of advice, and you could actually read that as pretty much a secular book, putting God to one side. These are all 600 little helpful hints for life. That's great, really good. But it's not good, because that's not the purpose of them. The purpose of them is to bring us to God. So the importance of chapters 1 to 9 is that chapters 1 to 9 establishes where that wisdom came from. We're going to put it into practice in 10 to 31. But where did it come from? Well, it came from God. And not only did it come from God, but it actually is God. It's actually who he is. It's not just that God has this wisdom. It describes it as being there right from the start, even before creation. It is actually who God is. And then in 10 to 31, how that would operate in daily life. So that's just a little bit about the structure of the book. As to the composition of the book, how is it actually put together? One of the things you find when you look at Proverbs and you read commentaries on Proverbs is one of the questions that always sort of people grapple with is it just a random lot of verses as if it's been sort of thrown up in the air and then just randomly shuffled together? Or is there some sort of order to it? And when you read various commentators, the problem is that generally what they'll say is, no, it's not random and it's got these certain themes to it, but I don't think I've ever read 2 that are the same. Every single one you read is different. And usually when they say, look, this chapter, the theme of this chapter is this, and there's 30 verses in the chapter, and they'll say, But there are a few exceptions. Verse 12 and 13 are different. Verse 15 is different again. Verse 22 is a different subject. And then some other writer will have a different opinion. So it is actually quite hard to find any sort of theme in it. Sometimes you come across a chapter where it's fairly obvious. So, for example, in chapter 26, there's a block of 12 verses where it talks about a fool 11 times. So clearly they would be blocked together. And then in chapter 26 also, there's a few verses there about sluggards and people that are slothful, and they clearly belong together. But as I say, for most of the book, from chapters 10 to 31, most commentators differ on that. And I think, personally, I think it's probably something that we can't really unravel, because a lot of the order of the book seems to be, if we were all fluent in Hebrew, we'd probably pick it up beautifully. But there's a lot of times that it's all about the Hebrew words, and there's Hebrew words that rhyme. So you might get a group of verses that are 5 verses that are together. They all say different things, but they've got some rhyming Hebrew word in there, which we wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. I presume most people here wouldn't know. We wouldn't pick it up. Or it might be that they all start with a word that starts with the same letter, and that would make it easy to remember if you knew Hebrew. So I think a lot of it is just that if we knew Hebrew, we'd pick up these things. I actually went through and, just as an exercise, I came up with these 9 different types of, or subject matter. Hopefully you can read that. Honesty, diligence, materialism, speech, humility versus pride, issues and relationships, learning wisdom, the consequences of good and evil, and God's supremacy. So there's 9 different subject matters, and I went through every verse in Proverbs and slotted each one into those headings. And doing that exercise, at least you can see that there are certainly blocks of subject matter together, but there's a lot of variation in there. It really is quite mixed up, but it probably wouldn't be in Hebrew. And that's fairly subjective anyway, because I've got honesty and speech, but if I come across a verse that was about speaking honestly, I can't remember what I did, but probably slotted in wherever it needed to be to make the point that I'm trying to make. So anyway, that was just one way of looking at it. But it is, so I don't think we ought to get too hung up about saying, well, this chapter we've got to try and pick a theme that fits in this particular chapter. Now, when it comes to the themes themselves within the book, what you find is that there are certain words that appear in some chapters more than others. So, for example, and this just helps to, I suppose, put some sort of order to the book. I don't want to get too hung up in all the sort of technical details. Not that they're that technical, but there's a graph, for instance, of the 31 chapters of Proverbs and the occurrence of the word but. And you can see clearly there's some chapters where it's overwhelmingly appears in those chapters. And those chapters contain a lot of proverbs where, it gives one side of a thing and then says another side. So, for example, in Proverbs 10:31 it says, the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut off. It gives one point of view, but the opposite is this. And there's obviously certain chapters where that is overwhelmingly, that appears. And that there's other examples of that. So the righteous and the just appear overwhelmingly frequently in some chapters, similarly with the wicked, only in that middle section. The different Hebrew words for fool and folly, etc. Chapter 14 goes into that a lot. Chapter 26, as we said before, so that's quite frequent. Yahweh's name himself appears way more in some chapters than others. So, again, what it tells us is that this is not just totally random. There is some sort of order to the way this is put together. And the other thing you find is that there are certain words that appear more in Proverbs than any other part of the Bible. And that helps just to sort of give us a flavour of the book. So, for example, Proverbs itself is, for the statistically minded, it is 2.6% of the Old Testament. 2.6% of the Old Testament. And yet we find that words like that you see there, the percentage on the right is the frequency, like, so for example, simple or simplicity. 79% of the occurrence of those words in the Old Testament is in Proverbs. And yet Proverbs is only 2.6% of the Bible. So those words there, in descending order, are overrepresented in the book of Proverbs. So that just is a way, I think, when you read through those words yourself, it just sort of gives you an additional idea of the flavour of this book, the sorts of things that this book is about. And you can see from that, as we all know, that those words are very much related to practical life. And that doesn't come as any surprise to it, but it's certainly borne out in the frequency and where those words appear. Now, when we look at Proverbs, the three main words that we need to sort of get a handle on that appear so often is wisdom, understanding and knowledge. Those words appear very, very frequently, as I'm sure we're all aware, through the book. And when you look at the definitions of those words in Hebrew, there they are. So if you just cast your eye over the green words there, the definitions, what that tells us, I think, is that there's a fair bit of similarity between these words. Because often what we tend to do in English, and those definitions, obviously the Hebrew definitions of the Hebrew word, in English, often what we would say is we say knowledge is about facts and wisdom is applying those facts in our life. And we can pick up the book of Proverbs and sort of have that in our head as we read the book. But I don't think that's really right in the Hebrew words themselves. There's a lot of similarity, as you can see, through those different words. And so whilst we say knowledge is facts and wisdom is applying those facts, what I think in the Hebrew is that, and not that I'm any expert in Hebrew at all, but it seems to be that the word wisdom, the Hebrew word for wisdom, includes the various other qualities that are encompassed in understanding, know and knowledge. In other words, they're fairly similar words. The difference between them is actually quite minimal, and they can actually be used interchangeably. Now, if someone here was an absolute expert on Hebrew, they might disagree with that. But the commentators that I've read, who are very, very well versed in the Hebrew, that seems to be the consensus of what they say. So, for example, I mean, if you look at, so you can see that colour coding there is what appears there. So those first 7 chapters that we read, first 7 verses that we read, those different words are sprinkled through the first 7 verses of the book. Wisdom, knowledge and understanding. And one commentator, Derek Kidner, you might have heard of him, he wrote a book on Proverbs, he said this. He said, the book of Proverbs opens by breaking up the plain daylight of wisdom into its rainbow of colours. These all shade into one another, and any one of them can be used to represent the whole. So I don't think we ought to get too hung up trying to distinguish between what those words mean. And there's a number of verses in Proverbs where clearly there is no distinction between them. They're sort of all clumped together in a group. And that particular writer, that was his view of that. So when we look at those first 7 verses, those words are just sort of dropped in there, and any one of them can be taken to represent any other. But one thing is for sure, and that is that none of them refer to head facts, right? They're not referring to IQ, a knowledge of, or just a whole lot of facts in our head. And we know that for sure because in those 7 verses, we also see the word instruction mentioned 3 times. And that word in the Hebrew means to chastise, to warn, to correct, to discipline, or to rebuke. And of course, none of those words have anything to do with a head full of facts. Those words are moral words. So we certainly need to know that none of these words, including the word knowledge, I don't think refers to facts in our head. It's all about morality. It's all about things that are actually practical in our life, that are actually, there's a right or wrong. The book is about moral issues. So therefore, if I was to try and define what wisdom actually means, that's what I reckon is a reasonable definition of the word wisdom. And I think that as we're about to see, I think any definition of wisdom must include God in it. Because this book is all about wisdom that is absolutely, exclusively related to God. That's all this book is interested in. Now, what is the key to the book of Proverbs? What we have to understand is that this book is not just a collection of helpful pieces of advice about how to handle challenges in life. That is not what this book is about. There is myriad books about that. If you go into a bookshop, you will see, as I'm sure you have, shelves. There'll be a whole section of books like that. And some of them are very famous books. And they're all about how to live life. And often they'll have lists of things to do. So you can see up in the top left, 52 key principles, 7 habits over here of highly effective people, 5 keys over on the left, 10 rules, 4 essential keys. So they have these lists and, there's all sorts of advice in there. And you look at those books and you think, well, many of them are probably quite useful books. I actually can't stand those sort of books. There's something about those books that just annoys me. But I'm sure that's just me. I'm sure there's a lot of really good advice in there. A lot of the advice in those books would be actually in Proverbs. Quite sure of that. And many of the Proverbs in our Bibles do give advice that would be worth following whether a person believed in God or not. But there's something unique about the book of Proverbs that separates it from all of those books that so much money has been made out of by those authors. And that is this, as Brother Isaac Collier said so simply, that the Proverbs of Solomon differ from the Proverbs of merely human origin in their continual reference to God. And that's just so important, isn't it? You compare that to those books there, and it's all about you. Your best year ever, up the top there. How to enjoy your life and your job. You can heal your life. The ultimate self-help book over on the left there. Awaken the giant within. I'm just waiting to awaken this giant within me. It's all about me. Now, the Proverbs are very different to that, aren't they? We know that. The book of Proverbs is not there to make us more successful, happier, stress-free, efficient, popular, or productive. Those things, as an end in themselves, are of absolutely no interest to God whatsoever. This book is designed to help us to be more like God. It's not a book about what works best in life, although obviously the advice in it does work best in life. It's not a book about that. It's a book about morality. It's not just a book about how to do things, it's a book about how to become something. And that's important. It's not a list of things to do, it's a collection of proverbs that help us to become a certain type of person. Of course, that is a person who is more like God. So Proverbs gives these hundreds of day-to-day real-life situations, and it's effectively telling us this is what God would do in that situation. This is how God would approach that circumstance. And if we do those things, aside from any other benefit that comes from it, because it is beneficial because it's the best way to live, but aside from all of that, what it's going to do is it's going to help us to come to know God. Like we said with that original scenario, we meet this person and we've got to somehow love them. Well, we've got to come to know them. We've got to spend time with them and do the things they do. Try and think like they do. And that is what this book helps us to do. It puts us right next to God and helps us to think and to live like He would, and like He does. But it puts God into all the little circumstances of our life. Now, the key to the book, I think, is the verse that we read earlier on, which is Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7. And there we read, "The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Now, the word fear What does the word fear mean? There's a lot said about the word fear, and I reckon one of the best things I ever read on it, from a writer who wrote a book about Proverbs, and he does have a very good understanding of the Hebrew. You can tell that. But what he said was that he said sometimes we read the word fear and we say, well, that's the word respect. Well, he said it's more than respect, but it's less than being scared of God. So it's somewhere between those two things. Respect doesn't quite do it, but being scared of God is a little too much the other way. So he said it's between those two things, and the word that he used was the word awe, A-W-E. That's the word he said it would be the best approximation in English of what that word actually means. It is, and we are in awe of God's power and character. So it says there in chapter 1 verse 7, an awe of God, of Yahweh, is the beginning of knowledge. And it's interesting to know that that phrase, a fear of God, it appears about 30 times in the Old Testament, and 16 of those are in the book of Proverbs, which that really surprised me. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, that if someone picks up Proverbs and takes a fairly sort of humanistic, secular approach to it and says, well, quite aside from anything else, this is good advice for living, be aware that the term fear of God appears more times in Proverbs than the rest of the Bible combined. So this is certainly not a book of helpful handy hints. It is a book designed to help us appreciate the greatness and the majesty of God. It's designed to put us in awe of God. This one particular writer said this in the NIV application commentary: fear of Yahweh requires that we remove ourselves as the centre of authority in our self-made universes. We turn from rebellion to teachability before God, submitting to authority greater than our own. And that, of course, is very different to the world that we currently live in today, which is obsessed with people's feelings. The world is addicted to feelings. I shouldn't have to do anything that I don't feel like doing. I shouldn't be made to do something that doesn't make me feel good. I should be allowed to do anything that makes me feel good. So my feelings are the ultimate arbiter of what I should do, as opposed to a higher authority commanding me to do what I wouldn't necessarily want to do. And that's, of course, why all those books are all about me and awakening the giant that's in me. It's helping me to self-help my life. It's all about myself. Now, the book of Proverbs says, if that's your approach to life, you cannot ever be wise. You might be efficient, you might be popular, you might be rich, you might have a great marriage, you might have a great family, a fantastic career, you might have all of that, but you will never ever be wise without having a fear of God. Now look what that verse says. Chapter 1 verse 7. It says, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Now I think chapter 1 verse 7 I think is the key to the book, and I think the word beginning is the key word in that verse. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. What does that word mean? Does it just mean it's the start of knowledge, or what's it talking about? Well, the Hebrew word for beginning means a first fruit. It's the first fruit of knowledge. Now, what's a first fruit? Well, if we look at a piece of fruit, right, there's an orange. That's an orange. Now, if that is a first fruit, we're getting very, very simple now. If that's a first fruit, what is the rest of the fruit going to look like? Well, we know what it's going to look like. It's going to be like that. They're going to be oranges. So when we pick up an orange, every subsequent piece of fruit that we pick from that tree is going to be identical to the first one, pretty much. So the first fruit and the following fruits are related. They look the same, they all taste the same, and they are the same. Now chapter 1 verse 7 of Proverbs says that the fear of God is that first orange, and the sort of knowledge that we're going to find in the book of Proverbs is based very much on that first orange. There's a direct relationship between those two things. So if I was to ask the question, here's the book of Proverbs, what sort of knowledge am I going to get from this book? What's it going to offer? The answer is, it is only going to offer the sort of knowledge and wisdom that springs from a fear of God or an awe of God. Every single proverb that I read must have that in it. Just like every single one of those oranges looks exactly like and must look exactly like the first orange if it comes from the same tree. Now that's very simple, isn't it? But that's what that verse is telling us, quite simply. And again, that Derek Kidner said this. He said, the beginning is the first and controlling principle, rather than a stage that one leaves behind. Furthermore, he said, the fear of the Lord is not merely the gateway, but the whole path of wisdom. Which what it's simply telling us is that we've got to see God in every proverb. We must see God in every single proverb we read. That's our approach to this book. Another writer by the name of Bruce Waltke, he said this. I thought it was really well put. He said, what the alphabet is to reading, notes to music, and numbers to mathematics, the fear of the Lord is to attaining the revealed knowledge of this book. So we don't learn the letters of the alphabet and then we don't need that information anymore because now we're reading. We will always need those basics. Nor do we get a fear of God that makes us pick up the book of Proverbs, but then we leave that behind and now we just read the book of Proverbs just as a simple little guide for life, handy hints for life. Doing that would be like doing that. It'd be like saying, well, here's this information that's come from a fear of God, but that apple, that's a nice piece of fruit. I'll pick that one. That might be a verse that says something about not being lazy and working hard in life. I find that in Proverbs, and that's a good thing. I don't believe in God, but that's a good piece of advice. Well, that you haven't got it from the fear of God. You've taken that totally out of context, says chapter 1, verse 7. And that's not the reason it was there. It's just not possible to do that. All of the knowledge that we read in the book must come from that first initial fear of God. So we read a proverb and we follow it because it's telling us something about God. And doing it will make us more like God. So you might get an atheist, for example, and he reads a verse about not being lazy. And he said, well, that's good advice. I'll put that in practice in my life. And he does. And it's good. Good for his career. He becomes quite productive and all of that. Great. But he's not going to get any closer to God. He's not going to develop wisdom. And that's what this book is all about. And if that's not our approach, then all we've done is we've put Proverbs up on the shelf with all those other books. So there it is in the middle, the book of Proverbs, 600 handy tips for daily living, which I wouldn't buy that one because that's way too many tips. 600 is way too many. But that's all we've done. We've put it up there along with all of the other helpful, handy guides for life. And we've just robbed the book of its entire meaning. So in summary, Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 is simply telling us that we've got to see God in every proverb. And that's why I think that's a reasonably good definition of wisdom. It must have God in it. We can't have a definition of wisdom that doesn't have God in it, and it is thinking like God thinks. That's what this book is going to tell us. But not only is it telling us that we need to see God in every proverb that we read, it's also telling us that if we want to be godly wise, we've got to see God in everything we do. And that's so important, isn't it? We should never think or say, I'm more practical than spiritual. That we should never say that. It's not right. Do you know, in the law of Moses, when we won't turn up any of these, but when Moses chose people to sew clothes, to sew Aaron's garments, it said that he chose wise-hearted people filled with the spirit of wisdom. When he chose people to make the materials of the tabernacle, it says in Exodus 35, all the women whose hearts stirred them up in wisdom spun goat's hair. These are women spinning goat's hair. When the furniture was made, he chose a man called Bezalel, and he said, I've filled him with a spirit of wisdom, understanding and knowledge in all manner of workmanship to devise artistic designs, gold, silver, bronze, stone and wood. Now, why didn't Moses just choose the best seamstress, the best goat hair spinner, the best designer and builder? The reason was because God wanted to invest godly wisdom in any and every task we do. That was so important to God. And godly wisdom can be brought to any task we perform, no matter how insignificant we may think it is. You'd think that spinning goat's hair, it's probably quite a skillful thing, I'm sure it is, but it seems like quite a task that would be considered a fairly low-rung task. And yet the women that did that were chosen because they had wisdom. And God said, I want you to put godly wisdom into every single task, including all the people who did practical things with their hands, who may have thought, I'm not spiritual, that's the priests are spiritual, I'm just practical, I'm very good with this goat's hair, I know how to do it. I'm really good at that, it's one thing I can do, but it's not spiritual. Well, it is, very much so, and it's very much something that the wisdom of God can be invested into that. So we've got to just simply ask ourselves all the time, what a task we do. If God was to perform this task, what sort of spirit would he bring to it? What sort of spirit would he want me to bring to it? And if we do that, then we're on our way to putting into practice the Proverbs in this book. So just to finish, when we open this book, as we're doing this weekend, we have the privilege of sitting at the feet of God and hearing him give his own godly advice about every conceivable challenge that we could ever face in life. 600 that's going to cover everything, isn't it? We're not going to find a challenge that's not in here. And God is saying to us, this is what I would do in that situation. This is how I would handle it. This is how I would think. What an amazing privilege it is. What a priceless gift this book is when it's telling us that. But it's not just a book that's telling us a list of things to do. God's not interested in us keeping a list of laws. He's not interested in us necessarily just keeping a list of proverbs as a list. He's interested in what we become, turning us in to different people. Just like us when we come to love someone. We don't love them because they just do a list of things that appeals to us. We love them because of who they are. And that's why we've got to love God. And that's why God will love us, because of who we become. It's a book about how to become like God. And let's just imagine how much closer we could get to God and how closer we will feel with our God if we follow the advice of this unique and very special book, and in some small way, hopefully, come to actually think and live like our dear Heavenly Father.